can list it online for luxury prices, and can list it online for luxury prices. And trust me, this madness only gets worse from here. 1. A bidding war actually erupted around a toaster shaped like the state of Texas, which would have been merely tacky if the seller hadn't claimed it was a rare artisanal geographic bread mapping device from the late 70s. One person apparently believed this because they asked whether it still imprinted borders accurately, as if toast-based cartography were a thriving academic discipline. The seller insisted the brown, scorched outline of Texas on the bread was a cultural artifact of national significance, ignoring the fact that every other state was technically represented inside the toaster too, just incinerated. To justify the $10,000 price tag, they explained that Americana never depreciates, which is an interesting economic theory considering the object looked like it had survived 3 divorces, 2 kitchen fires, and 1 passionate disagreement with gravity. Someone eventually placed a bid purely out of curiosity, proving once again that the internet will throw money at anything if you describe it loudly enough. 2. A rusted treadmill from the early 2000s was posted with the confidence of someone auctioning off a sacred relic, complete with phrases like vintage fitness heritage and a museum-grade example of pre-smart cardio technology. One interested bidder wanted to know if the belt still moved. The seller responded that movement was irrelevant in the presence of historical value, which is exactly what people say when an object no longer functions and hasn't since the Bush administration. The description bragged that celebrity athletes may or may not have once used a similar model, which is the kind of fact that's technically true because athletes have used treadmills at some point in human history. The $10,000 asking price was justified as an investment into America's wellness legacy, though most observers quietly suspected it was just an investment into the seller's rent. Nothing communicates national pride quite like selling a broken running machine as a patriotic artifact. 3. A person attempted to auction off a single, partially melted garden gnome after claiming it was one of the last surviving examples of early suburban fantasy craftsmanship. The gnome, if it could still legally be called that, had half a face, 1 intact shoe, and a hat that looked like it had been personally attacked by the sun. Nevertheless, the seller insisted it possessed symbolic emotional resonance from a simpler era, which is a poetic way of saying they left it too close to a backyard grill and refused to accept blame. They listed it as rare pre-distortion edition, as if the gnome hadn't simply slumped like it heard disappointing news. When asked why it was worth $10,000, the seller explained that nostalgia is priceless, which is apparently true only if you define nostalgia as heat-damaged lawn debris. Shockingly, someone considered bidding, proving art truly is subjective, or that boredom is a dangerous force. 4. A dented refrigerator door, just the door, not the refrigerator, showed up in an online auction labeled as mid-century cold storage portal, a phrase crafted specifically to confuse anyone with common sense. The seller emphasized that the dents were natural patina from decades of honorable service, which is an extremely generous interpretation of what looked like repeated collisions with an impatient teenager's forehead. To justify the staggering price, the seller noted that modern fridges rarely produce such authentic texture, implying that home appliances were once hand-sculpted by Renaissance sculptors instead of factory conveyors. A potential buyer asked if it had any documented provenance. The seller replied that its energy belongs to the 1950s, which is an excellent way to dodge the fact that it came from a broken unit left beside an apartment dumpster. Calling it vintage was ambitious. Calling it a portal was heroic. Calling it $10,000 was delusional. 5. An old flip phone missing half its keypad appeared as a vintage communication artifact of the pre-touchscreen era, a description dripping with the sort of reverence usually reserved for ancient scrolls. The seller swore the phone had personality, which is indeed true if personality is defined as closing itself spontaneously because the hinge is tired of living. They claimed the missing buttons created intentional minimalism, similar to how a raccoon knocking over your garbage creates intentional landscaping. Their justification for the $10,000 asking price was that technology like this will never return, which is absolutely correct, though not in the triumphant way they meant it. One bidder asked whether the phone powered on. The seller responded, "Spiritual power matters more than electrical power. inadvertently confirming that the device had the same practical function as a rock. A very committed rock, but still a rock. 6. A single rollerblade, just one, showed up under the listing Rare Asymmetrical Mobility Device, which is the kind of phrase you invent when you're trying to elevate an accidental thrift store purchase into luxury branding. The seller swore it was designed for avant-garde movement studies, conveniently ignoring the fact that no one has ever studied movement by strapping a lone-wheeled boot to one foot and praying for balance. They claimed the missing second rollerblade made it philosophically complete, which is a bold stance from someone who clearly lost the other one in a move. When asked why it cost $10,000, the seller explained that athletic minimalism is the future, which would be more convincing if the item didn't look like it had been run over by the future. Still, several watchers added it to their favorites, suggesting the world is moments away from adopting single-foot skating as a lifestyle choice for tax reasons. 7. A cracked ceramic bowl with a chip the size of a moral failing was listed as a handcrafted rustic relic from the early microwave era, which is a very polite phrase for bowl that witnessed 1,000 reheated leftovers and finally gave up. The seller insisted the cracks were narrative lines, as if the bowl had been journaling. They even claimed the chip reveals authenticity, the same way a missing roof reveals a house's personality. Their justification for the $10,000 price was that Japanese collectors appreciate imperfections, which is a spectacular misunderstanding of an entire art philosophy and also of what constitutes imperfection versus structural collapse. One interested buyer asked if it was safe for food. The seller answered, "It's safe for aesthetic contemplation," which is the universal language of "don't put soup in this unless you enjoy tetanus." Nevertheless, someone considered it art, proving humanity's resilience to logic. 8. A VHS tape labeled simply "Wedding" appeared on an auction site with the description "Mysterious Analog Cinema with Potential Historical Significance." The seller refused to play it, not because they lacked a VCR, but because they wanted to preserve the intrigue, which is code for "I'm scared it contains something cursed or aggressively boring." They floated the idea that it might document a forgotten love story, which is technically probable, given that it almost certainly contains two people standing near a minister and regretting things. How this warranted a $10,000 price was explained in a breathtaking sentence. Narrative ambiguity is extremely valuable in today's market, which is just a fancy way of saying, "I think someone out there is nosy enough to pay for this." Whether the wedding belonged to celebrities, strangers, or the seller's neighbors remains unknown, mostly because buyers realized mystery is fun only until money is involved. 9. A person tried auctioning off a sun-bleached lawn chair by calling it a vintage relaxation throne from the golden era of backyard culture. The chair had clearly lived a hard life. One arm bowed inward like it was reconsidering its purpose, while the fabric sagged with the exhaustion of several decades of barbecues. The seller insisted these flaws were comfort adaptations, suggesting the chair had evolved like a biological species under harsh suburban conditions. To explain the $10,000 price, they claimed that outdoor leisure heritage is disappearing, which is true only if you ignore the existence of every hardware store in the country. A potential buyer asked if the fabric was original. The seller said yes, with the solemnity of someone discussing royal lineage. Even so, most observers recognized the object for what it was: a sunburned rectangle held together by nostalgia and stubborn optimism. 10. A broken lava lamp, permanently frozen in a lumpy mid-eruption, was advertised as an avant-garde time capsule capturing the precise moment of cosmic stillness. The seller argued that traditional lava lamps move too much, claiming this one's immobility represented the peace we lost in modern society. They blamed the lamp's arrested state on intentional artistic restraint instead of the far more likely culprit, a power cord that looked gnawed by fate. The $10,000 price was justified by calling it a rare example of geological minimalism, which is an inventive way to describe congealed wax. One interested shopper asked if it could be fixed. The seller replied that fixing it would destroy the message, which is remarkable confidence coming from someone auctioning an appliance that quit halfway through its only job. Still, the listing attracted watchers, proving the world contains buyers who appreciate philosophical wax clumps. 11. Someone tried selling a faded band t-shirt for the cost of a used car, describing it as a historic textile from the golden age of live music. The shirt looked like it had been worn through 3 decades of concerts, potholes, and questionable decisions, but the seller insisted the holes were ventilation in its purest form. They claimed the band was hugely influential, which was bold, considering the logo was so washed out it could have belonged to a band, a bakery, or a bowling league. Their reasoning for the $10,000 price hinged on the idea that fashion is temporary, but authenticity is eternal, which is poetic until you realize authenticity shouldn't crumble in your hands. A buyer asked if it had been washed. The seller said no, to preserve the energy, a phrase that instantly repelled 97% of humanity. The remaining 3% must have had very strong immune systems. 12. A handheld gaming console missing its screen somehow entered the auction world under the title Pre-Digital Imagination Platform, which is a stunningly creative way to say broken toy that can no longer do the one thing it exists for. The seller claimed that children today don't appreciate the power of visualizing gameplay, suggesting that staring into a rectangular void builds character. To justify the $10,000 asking price, they emphasized that modern devices rely too heavily on external stimulation, making this silent blank machine a mind-expanding artifact. A potential buyer asked how one would actually play it. The seller responded, "Play is internal," a phrase that belongs in a yoga brochure, not an electronics listing. Still, the device developed a small following among people who enjoy owning conceptual art pieces that challenge the notion of functionality, and also challenge their ability to explain purchases to friends. 13. A pair of sunglasses missing one lens appeared under the bold title, Asymmetrical Luxury Eyewear for the Fashionably Daring. The seller claimed the uneven design created a dynamic interplay between protection and vulnerability, as if the sunglasses were engaged in philosophical debate rather than falling apart. They insisted the missing lens liberates the wearer from visual conformity, which is another way of saying prepare to squint aggressively on one side. Their argument for the $10,000 price rested on the statement that imperfection is the new perfection, a sentiment beloved by people trying to sell broken things at extraordinary markups. One potential buyer asked whether the surviving lens offered UV protection. The seller answered, "It offers spiritual protection, a benefit rarely covered by optometrists." The glasses remained listed, admired mostly by people who wanted to feel fashionable without the burden of depth perception. 14. A warped wooden spoon, curved so dramatically it resembled a question mark questioning its own existence, was listed as an heirloom culinary wand. The seller claimed it had stirred countless ancestral soups, which may have been true, assuming those ancestors treated kitchen tools with the same disregard as they treated basic geometry. The spoon's bend was explained as organic adaptation, as though it had evolved in the wild and not a dishwasher. To defend the $10,000 price, the seller insisted it was a relic from before mass-production diluted craftsmanship, ignoring the fact that the spoon looked mass-produced and then personally disappointed. One interested viewer asked whether it was food-safe. The seller confidently answered that it was soul-safe, confirming they had absolutely no idea what food safety meant. Despite everything, the item gained attention from people who enjoy owning objects that look permanently startled. 15. A dusty aquarium castle missing its entire base was introduced as a mythic underwater ruin with profound architectural significance. The seller argued that the jagged bottom edge, evidence of an unfortunate drop, actually symbolized the collapse of old empires, turning their clumsy accident into a lecture on historical decline. They suggested buyers could meditate on impermanence while staring at it, though most people would likely meditate on why they were staring at broken plastic. To justify the $10,000 valuation, the seller highlighted its emotional wear, a term not recognized by any appraisal organization but apparently powerful enough for the internet. When someone asked if it was at least safe to put in an aquarium, the seller said, "It is safe for the imagination," meaning absolutely not. Still, the castle attracted views, proving even fish-themed real estate can tempt collectors if you attach enough existential vocabulary. 16. A taxidermied squirrel wearing a tiny tuxedo hit the auction block with the gravitas of a royal portrait, despite the squirrel's expression suggesting it had personally witnessed every bad decision leading to its own wardrobe. The seller insisted it was a prestige conversation artifact, apparently believing wealthy collectors spend their evenings analyzing the emotional arcs of rodents dressed for formal occasions. And when challenged about the $10,000 starting bid, they claimed it represented the intersection of nature and high culture, which is certainly one way to frame a squirrel that permanently looks like it's late to a disastrous wedding reception. 17. A lone television remote wrapped entirely in duct tape appeared online under the title Universal Controller from a Purer Technological Age, as though the late 90s were a sacred monastic period of button-pressing enlightenment. Most of the tape hid missing keys, but the seller insisted it was intentionally streamlined, and when asked whether it could still turn anything on, they argued that true power is conceptual, an answer that did nothing to justify a $10,000 price tag for an object with the functional ambition of a small brick. 18. A semi-broken stapler that refused to close properly was promoted as a vintage document fastening sculpture, which is a bold attempt to canonize an office tool that looked like it had been fired from its job mid-performance review. The seller described its inability to staple as a commentary on communication fatigue, and the $10,000 price was defended by claiming it was a relic from the era when office supplies had soul, a sentiment strongly contradicted by the stapler's visible determination to detach itself from reality. 19. A warped Halloween mask, bent into an expression one might call melting panic, was auctioned as a prototype character design from a forgotten animation movement, though the only movement evident was gravity acting relentlessly on cheap plastic. The seller insisted its asymmetry conveyed raw vulnerability, which might be compelling if the mask didn't look like it had lost an argument with a heater. Yet they still demanded $10,000 while refusing to explain how one might safely wear something so determined to self-destruct. 20. A keyboard missing 13 keys was framed as a minimalist typing experience for visionary creators, which is a flattering way to describe equipment that had clearly been attacked by someone allergic to vowels. The seller argued that the missing letters encouraged intentionality, though what it mostly encouraged was guesswork. And when buyers questioned the $10,000 price, the seller claimed limitations fuel genius, a philosophy beloved by people selling broken technology and feared by anyone who has ever tried typing an email. 21. A charred waffle iron, permanently locked open like it was screaming into the void, was celebrated online as a precision culinary forge, a phrase so determinedly optimistic it deserved an award. The seller insisted the burns were performance marks from experimental cuisine, which was generous considering the iron looked like it had survived warfare, and they justified the $10,000 price by insisting true cooks value history, apparently assuming history was synonymous with toast your eyebrows off if plugged in. 22. A completely deflated yoga ball, resembling a giant rubber raisin, was pitched as a vintage wellness sphere for meditative surrender, a description so poetic it nearly distracted from the fact that the ball could no longer perform its only function. The seller claimed its limp form reflected the acceptance of impermanence, and defended the $10,000 valuation by announcing that authentic vulnerability is rare, a phrase suspiciously convenient for someone selling a collapsed balloon. 23. A faded, crooked family portrait featuring strangers no one could identify was offered as an anonymous Americana tableau, a phrase that magically transformed an attic reject into an existential art piece. The seller argued the photo's lack of context created room for personal mythology, which is a polite way to say, make up whatever story helps justify the $10,000 price, and they insisted the warped frame added dynamic imperfection, though it mostly added splinters. 24. A vinyl record warped into a gentle spiral, making it physically incapable of lying flat, let alone playing music, was bragged about as a sonic relic resisting conventional playback, as if refusing to function were a personality trait. The seller called the resulting noise experimental sound waves, while others might call it the audio equivalent of being chased by geese, and still demanded $10,000 on the grounds that unplayability enhances mystique, a statement that would bankrupt the entire music industry if taken seriously. 25. A mismatched pair of boots, one cowboy, one rain boot, was marketed as asymmetrical adventurer footwear, boldly suggesting fashion innovation where there was clearly only confusion. The seller swore the mismatch symbolized dual identities of ruggedness and emotional flexibility, and then priced the pair at $10,000, apparently confident that someone, somewhere, wanted to walk through life looking like two different people lost at the same time. 26. A cracked mirror, shedding flakes faster than its owner could sweep them, was posted as a fragmented self-perception device, a phrase that attempted to transform basic household danger into therapy. The seller argued the fractures multiplied introspective opportunities, which is certainly one way to describe a mirror actively surrendering to gravity, and they asked $10,000 while suggesting that art involves risk, especially for buyers who prefer keeping their fingertips. 27. A crumpled paper fast food crown, creased, faded, and unquestionably abandoned by a child mid-tantrum, was renamed a vintage ceremonial headpiece of transient monarchy, elevating a $0 object into a $10,000 philosophical dissertation. The seller insisted its wrinkles represented the burden of leadership, which is an elaborate interpretation of something that dissolves in rain. Yet collectors lingered, drawn to the idea of owning royalty without needing to respect it. 28. A melted candle that no longer resembled anything found in nature was sold as an intuitive wax sculpture from the subconscious realm, granting it the mystique of a seance gone wrong. The seller claimed the drips revealed messages formed beyond conscious thought, a convenient explanation for an object shaped like a cryptid made of taffy, and they valued it at $10,000 while assuring buyers that its initial form is irrelevant, which was fortunate because its initial form was probably just a candle. 29. A blank, yellowed notebook, its pages warped by humidity and sorrow, was described as an untouched literary vessel awaiting the right mind, implying destiny where there was clearly procrastination. The seller insisted the empty pages carried accumulated creative potential, which is a noble spin on a notebook that had only ever participated in dust collection, and they set a $10,000 price while warning that writing in it would diminish its meaning, instantly eliminating its sole purpose. 30. A garden hose knotted into a shape that defied Euclidean geometry was listed as a sculptural study of domestic tension, which is a polite translation of "someone shoved this into a shed and hoped for the best." The seller claimed the tangles represented the battle between order and nature, and boldly priced it at $10,000, despite acknowledging it could no longer carry water, instead promising it could carry ideas, a feature most homeowners rarely seek in lawn equipment. 31. A crooked metal coat rack leaning so dramatically it should have come with a warning label was presented as a modernist equilibrium experiment, which theoretically excused its inability to stand straight. The seller argued its tilt embodied the instability of contemporary existence, a phrase apparently meant to distract from the $10,000 price, and when asked how many coats it could safely hold, they answered, "It holds expectations," the only honest sentence in the entire listing. And that's the grand tour of overpriced nonsense, proof that humanity will sell anything if you call it vintage. Drop your pick for the dumbest one in the comments, and maybe subscribe before someone lists that too.